On the morning of November 10th, 1898, roughly 500 armed white men gathered at the armory of the Wilmington Light Infantry on North 4th Street in Wilmington, North Carolina. By the time they finished marching 4 blocks south toward Free Love Hall, the crowd had swollen to nearly 2,000. What they carried with them was not uncertainty. It was a printed list of grievances, a stockpile of rifles that had been quietly accumulated for weeks, and a target, the Daily Record, the only black-owned daily newspaper in the state, and the editorial its publisher had written nearly 6 months earlier. By sundown, the newspaper's building had been burned to a frame the crowd posed in front of for photographs. The elected government of the city had been forced out at gunpoint, and somewhere between 14 and 90 black residents, depending on which count you trust, and none of them are complete, lay dead in the streets, the swamps, and the cemetery where survivors hid for 3 days. For most of the following century, this event appears in North Carolina textbooks, if it appears at all, as a race riot. The word riot implies spontaneity, implies that violence erupted from both sides in roughly equal measure, implies that no one planned it. Every part of that implication is false, and the men who planned it left behind enough paper to prove it themselves. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Wilmington in the 1890s was not the deep south of plantation myth. It was the largest city in North Carolina, a working port on the Cape Fear River, and for a brief window, it was one of the most functional multiracial democracies the post-war South had produced. Black residents made up a majority of the city's population. Black men served on the board of aldermen, in the police department, on the customs house staff, and in skilled trades that ran the city's daily commerce. There were black-owned restaurants, a black-owned bank in the planning stages, black attorneys, black physicians, and Alexander Manly's Daily Record, a paper that reported on black civic life with the same seriousness the white papers reserved for their own. This arrangement existed because of the Fusion Coalition, an alliance between Republicans, largely black voters and office holders, and populists, largely white farmers frustrated with the Democratic establishment and its ties to railroad and banking interests. Fusion had won the state legislature in 1894 and again in 1896, and in Wilmington specifically, it had produced a city government that included black aldermen and a white Republican mayor, Silas Wright, who owed his office in part to black votes. The coalition was never without internal tension. Populist farmers who allied with Republicans on questions of currency and railroad regulation did not necessarily share the Republican Party's commitment to black civil rights, and Democratic strategists worked deliberately to widen that gap wherever they found it, offering white populists a return to the party of their fathers if they would abandon their black political partners. Some accepted. Enough did not, in the 2 elections before 1898, to keep Fusion in power, which is precisely what made the arrangement so intolerable to the men who eventually organized its violent end. The Democratic Party's leadership viewed this arrangement as an existential threat, not because Wilmington's government was failing, but because it was working, and its success was the clearest evidence available that white political dominance was not a natural law. Furnifold Simmons, the state party chairman, organized the 1898 campaign around what he later described as a strategy of men who could write, speak, and ride. Writers staffed a coordinated propaganda campaign through papers like the News and Observer in Raleigh, which ran cartoons depicting black political participation as an existential danger to white women. Speakers, including Alfred Waddell, a former Confederate officer and former congressman, delivered increasingly violent rhetoric at rallies across the region. In one widely reported address, Waddell told a Wilmington crowd that white men should be willing to choke the Cape Fear River with carcasses if that was what it took to keep black men from the polls. Riders organized as the Red Shirts, a paramilitary group modeled on similar organizations in South Carolina, moved through the countryside on horseback, pulling black men from their homes, whipping them, and warning them against voting. Into this campaign came the editorial that history has remembered as the spark, though calling it a spark obscures how deliberately it was used. In August of 1898, Rebecca Felton, a Georgia writer and future senator, gave a speech endorsing lynching as protection for white women, declaring that she would lynch 1,000 men a week if that was what it took to shield what she called woman's dearest possession. Alexander Manley answered her in the Daily Record. He did not deny that assaults occurred. He argued that many relationships between black men and white women were consensual rather than coerced, and he noted, correctly and dangerously for the time, that white men routinely assaulted black women without any comparable outcry or legal consequence. The editorial ran in August. It caused little immediate reaction. Democratic operatives held onto it and reprinted it across the state in the final weeks before the November election, timing its widest circulation for maximum effect, precisely when it would do the most to inflame white voters heading into Election Day. The campaign's written arm deserves its own attention, because it did not operate at the margins of the state's press. Josephus Daniels, publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer and later Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of the Navy, ran the paper as an instrument of the Democratic campaign rather than as an independent voice reporting on it. Daniels commissioned a recurring cartoon series depicting black political power as a literal vampire draped over the state, and he reprinted Manley's August editorial repeatedly through October and into November, stripped of context, alongside editorials warning white readers that their wives and daughters were in immediate physical danger. Daniels later called the paper's role in the campaign among his proudest achievements, a claim few institutions in Raleigh chose to revisit for decades. A group of Wilmington's most prominent white businessmen, later identified by historians as the Secret Nine, met privately in the weeks before the election to plan what would happen after the votes were counted, regardless of the outcome. Their intent was not contingent on a Democratic loss. Even a Democratic win at the state and county level would leave Wilmington's city government, which was elected on a staggered schedule, still under fusion control until the following spring. The Secret Nine decided that the city government would be removed by force if it was not removed by ballot, and they began coordinating with the Wilmington Light Infantry, a nominally private militia company that maintained access to a Gatling gun and a supply of rifles held in a city armory. Election Day itself, November 8th, passed with heavy voter intimidation but without mass violence, and Democrats won commanding majorities across the state on a wave of fraud, threats, and armed suppression at the polls. Wilmington's municipal offices were not up for a vote that day. The men who wanted them anyway did not wait for the next election. On November 9th, a mass meeting of white citizens convened at the county courthouse and adopted what was formally titled the White Man's Declaration of Independence, a document that announced, in the language of the nation's founding, that the white people of the state would no longer be ruled by men of African origin. The declaration demanded that Alexander Manley leave the city permanently, that the Daily Record cease publication, and that a group of prominent black citizens deliver a written response accepting these terms by 7:30 the following morning. A committee of black leaders, meeting in a barbershop because they had nowhere else considered safe, drafted a reply. They stated plainly that they had no authority to speak for Manley, who had already fled the city, and that they did not endorse his editorial, but that in the interest of peace, they would use what influence they had to see the committee's demands satisfied. The letter was addressed to Alfred Waddell, who by then had been named chairman of the Committee of 25, tasked with enforcing the declaration. Through what has never been fully explained as accident or design, the reply did not reach Waddell by the deadline. Some accounts describe a mail delay. Others describe a decision, whether by the postmaster or by someone closer to Waddell, not to deliver it in time. Among those who signed the letter were ministers, a physician, and several businessmen whose names would later appear on the banishment lists anyway, regardless of their conciliatory tone the night before. The historian Leray Umfleet, who later compiled the state's official account, noted that the timing failure was never adequately explained, and that the ambiguity served the men waiting at the armory more than it served the truth. Waddell led the crowd to the Daily Records building without waiting to see whether the terms had been met. The building was empty. Manley had left the state days earlier, correctly anticipating what was coming. The mob broke in, searched the building, and left it burning. What followed was not contained to the newspaper office. Armed men fanned out through Wilmington's black neighborhoods, particularly the area known as Brooklyn, on the pretext of searching for weapons and enforcing order. Near the intersection of 4th and Harnett Streets, a confrontation between black residents gathered outside a grocery store and white men outside a nearby saloon ended in gunfire, and accounts differ sharply on who fired first, though the presence of an organized, armed white militia already moving through the city makes the question of a single triggering shot almost beside the point. The Wilmington Light Infantry deployed with its machine gun crew. Members of the Red Shirts and the White Government Union moved street to street. Black residents, most of them unarmed or unable to match the weaponry arrayed against them, were shot as they ran. Homes in Brooklyn were entered and searched, sometimes burned, and men found inside were sometimes shot on their own porches in front of their families. Survivors later described hiding for 2 nights in Oakdale Cemetery and in the swamps north of the city, in November weather, with children, listening to gunfire they could not see and could not locate, uncertain whether returning home meant returning to safety or walking back into a patrol. Some families later described crossing the Cape Fear River on whatever boats they could find, choosing an uncertain night crossing over another hour in a city that had made its intentions unmistakable. By early afternoon, the violence had accomplished its second objective. A delegation confronted Mayor Silas Wright and the Board of Aldermen, several of whom were black, and presented them with prepared letters of resignation. Wright resigned under direct threat. So did the police chief and most of the sitting aldermen, black and white alike. A new board, hand-selected by the Committee of 25 rather than elected by any voter, convened within hours and installed Alfred Waddell as mayor. No court challenged this transfer of power. No federal authority intervened, though President William McKinley's administration was informed of events as they unfolded by telegram within hours, and chose, as it had chosen with growing consistency throughout the 1890s, not to send troops or federal marshals into a southern state to protect black citizens or the government they had helped elect. It remains, by the assessment of most historians who have studied it, the only successful coup d'etat in the history of the United States. A violent overthrow of a legitimately elected government carried out entirely on domestic soil against American citizens. The killing did not end when the new government was seated. Over the following days, armed patrols rounded up black men suspected of resisting, or simply of prominence, marched dozens of them at gunpoint to the train depot, and forced them onto outbound trains under threat of death if they returned. Alexander Manley's brother Frank was among those banished, along with physicians, ministers, and businessmen who had built careers in the city's black professional class over the preceding 2 decades. In the weeks that followed, an estimated 2,100 black residents left Wilmington permanently, some walking out of the city on foot because they had no other means, joining the men already forced onto trains. Some who left never returned even to visit, and family letters preserved by descendants describe a generation that spoke of Wilmington rarely and carefully, if at all, passing down warnings about the city more often than memories of it. The exodus reversed the city's racial demographics within a matter of months. A black-majority city with a functioning multiracial government became, in the space of one afternoon and the weeks that followed it, a city governed exclusively by the men who had burned a newspaper office to enforce that outcome. Among the names the coroner's office did manage to record were John L. Gregory and John L. Townsend, ordinary residents whose deaths entered the official record only because someone with standing chose to report them, a threshold that an unknown number of other victims never crossed. Families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers that afternoon frequently had no surviving avenue to report a death at all, since the same armed patrols responsible for the killing controlled the streets for days afterward. and since the new city government installed that evening, had no interest in compiling a record that would indict its own installation. No official death toll was ever established. The coroner's inquest recorded a partial list of names, men whose bodies were identifiable and whose deaths were reported to authorities willing to record them, and historians examining that record alongside newspaper accounts, family histories, and burial records have since concluded that the true number is almost certainly higher than the 14 the inquest confirmed, and plausibly approaches the 60 to 90 cited in later scholarship, though a precise count may never be recoverable because no one in power at the time had any interest in producing one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened after November 10th is, in its own way, as consequential as the violence itself. The new Wilmington government did not simply hold power, it moved immediately to entrench it. Alfred Waddell used his position to pursue a program of disenfranchisement, working alongside the state Democratic leadership to draft a suffrage amendment that added a literacy test and a poll tax to North Carolina's Constitution in 1900, provisions written with a grandfather clause exempting white voters whose ancestors had been eligible to vote before Reconstruction. The amendment's principal drafter, the Wilmington attorney George Rountree, had been present in the city during the events of November 10th and spoke afterward of the coup and the amendment as two stages of a single project, the first clearing the ground and the second making certain nothing grew back. The amendment passed. Black political participation in North Carolina, which had produced congressmen, state legislators, and city officials throughout the 1890s, collapsed and did not meaningfully recover for more than 6 decades. George Henry White, the last black congressman elected from North Carolina in this period, left office in 1901 and, in his farewell address to the House of Representatives, predicted that black Americans would one day return to Congress, though he acknowledged he did not expect to live to see it. No black North Carolinian would again serve in Congress for the better part of a century, and no black candidate would win a congressional seat anywhere in the former Confederacy until 1972, a gap directly attributable to the disenfranchisement architecture built in Wilmington's aftermath and exported statewide. Wilmington's coup was not treated by the state as an aberration to be investigated. It was treated as a template. Democratic newspapers across North Carolina and beyond described the events of November 10th not as a massacre or a coup, but as a race riot, a term that placed the violence's origin with the black community rather than with the armed white men who had planned, announced, and executed it days in advance. That framing did not fade with time. It hardened into the official record. Local histories, memorial plaques, and school curricula in North Carolina repeated the riot framing for most of the 20th century, and the men who led the coup were remembered locally not as insurrectionists but as civic reformers who had restored order. Alfred Waddell served as mayor for years afterward without serious challenge to his legitimacy. A street in Wilmington bore his name. The record does not sit entirely on the side of the men who wrote it that way at the time. Alexander Manley, exiled from the city he had served, eventually settled in Philadelphia, where he continued working as a house painter and occasionally as a writer, and where he lived until 1944 without ever being permitted to return safely to Wilmington to resume the paper he had built. His descendants preserved family accounts of the exile that would not enter the official record for generations. Surviving copies of the Daily Record itself are exceedingly rare, most destroyed in the fire or discarded afterward, and the ones that remain are held today by the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center in partnership with the Cape Fear Museum, reconstructed in part from quotations that appeared in other newspapers of the era, papers that reprinted Manley's words not to preserve them, but to condemn them, and which ended up, by accident, functioning as an archive. Oral histories collected decades later from descendants of survivors, families who fled into the swamps or boarded trains under armed guard, describe a version of November 10th that the official record spent 100 years declining to absorb. It was not a riot, they described, it was an occupation. The state of North Carolina did not formally revisit the events of 1898 until the very end of the 20th century. In 1998, on the coup's centennial, a coalition of historians, descendants, and civic leaders pushed for a public reckoning that the state legislature had never authorized. 2 years later, in 2000, the General Assembly created the North Carolina General Assembly's Wilmington Race Riot Commission, later formally the 1898 Commission, and charged it with producing a comprehensive historical account. The Commission's report, delivered in 2006 after years of archival research led by historian Lorraine Umfleet, concluded plainly that the events of November 10th constituted a coup d'état and a coordinated massacre, not a spontaneous riot, and that the coup had been planned in advance by identifiable named individuals, including members of the Secret Nine, with the specific goal of overthrowing a legally elected government, regardless of the election's outcome. The report ran to more than 400 pages and drew on newspaper archives, personal correspondence, court records, and family testimony that had never been assembled in one place before. It named names. It listed the members of the Committee of 25 by occupation and by the roles they played in the days surrounding the coup, and it traced, block by block, the movement of armed groups through Brooklyn and the surrounding neighborhoods on the afternoon of November 10th. The report also documented the economic dimension of the coup in detail that earlier accounts had rarely attempted. It described how black-owned businesses, including a grocery, a tailoring shop, a drugstore, and the beginnings of a black-owned savings and loan, were abandoned in the exodus and either sold under duress or simply seized outright by white creditors and neighbors in the months that followed. Property records examined by the Commission showed transfers of black-owned land and buildings clustering heavily in the weeks after the coup, at prices well below assessed value, to buyers who in several documented cases had participated directly in the violence that produced the vacancy. This transfer of wealth and opportunity to the white business class that had organized the coup was never reversed, and later, economic analyses of Wilmington's racial wealth gap, conducted by researchers at institutions including the University of North Carolina, have traced measurable disparities in generational property ownership back to the specific parcels and streets emptied in November of 1898. A single afternoon of violence, in other words, did not simply end political careers. It rearranged, in ways still visible in county tax records more than a century later, who in Wilmington owned what. The Commission's findings also traced what happened to the men who led the coup, and the answer, for most of them, was very little. Alfred Waddell remained mayor of Wilmington until 1905, retiring from office rather than being removed from it, and he spent his later years writing and lecturing, including a novel that recast the events of 1898 in flattering terms for a northern readership curious about the New South. Members of the Secret Nine returned to their businesses without interruption. Several went on to serve in the state legislature or on civic boards. Their roles in the coup either omitted from local biography entirely or reframed, in the language of the period, as necessary and patriotic. No one involved in organizing or carrying out the killings on November 10th was ever prosecuted for them in state or federal court, and no serious effort to prosecute appears in the surviving record. The legal system that might have held them accountable was, by the afternoon of November 10th, already theirs. A memorial park dedicated to the victims of the 1898 coup was not established in Wilmington until 2008, a full 110 years after the event. Built on a small parcel near the site of the violence, and funded through a combination of state and private contributions rather than through any sustained public commitment from the city itself. Fundraising for even that modest memorial took years longer than its organizers anticipated, and early proposals for a more prominent site nearer downtown were set aside in favor of the smaller parcel that was ultimately available, a compromise several of the descendants involved in the planning process later described as disappointing but, given a century of prior silence, still better than nothing. The park includes a modest sculptural marker and interpretive signage, and it remains, more than a century on, one of relatively few physical acknowledgements in a city whose entire modern political and economic structure was set in motion by what happened there. Public awareness beyond North Carolina remained limited even after the Commission's report, in part because the report itself, thorough as it was, functioned largely as a government document rather than a piece of popular history. That changed to some degree in 2020 when the journalist David Zucchino published Wilmington's Lie, a narrative account that drew on the Commission's research and additional archival work to bring the coup to a national audience for the first time in a widely read format, and which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize the following year. Even then, the book's reception in North Carolina itself was uneven, with some local institutions embracing the renewed attention and others treating it as a rehashing of a story better left in the past, a tension that echoes the same disagreement over framing that has followed the events of November 10th since the week they occurred. Descendants of both the victims and, in some cases, of the men who organized the coup have in recent years pursued further reckoning, including calls for reparative measures and formal apologies from the city and state, most of which remain unresolved. A city-appointed task force examined the feasibility of reparations for descendants of those killed or driven from Wilmington in the years following the Commission's report, and its recommendations, like much of the reckoning that followed 2006, moved slowly through a political process that had 100 years of institutional inertia to overcome. Streets and buildings named for Waddell and other coup leaders came under renewed scrutiny in the 2020s, with some municipal bodies voting to rename them, and others declining or deferring the question, a pattern that suggests the argument over what to call November 10th, riot or coup or massacre, has outlived every person who lived through it and shows no sign of resolving cleanly, even now. Alfred Waddell's name persisted on public infrastructure in Wilmington well into the 21st century before recent renaming efforts began, slowly, to remove it. The coroner's incomplete list of the dead is held today in county archival collections, alongside a growing body of research from institutions including the University of North Carolina, whose library guides now catalog primary documents, family interviews, and surviving fragments of the daily record for anyone willing to look for them. Some of that research has come from descendants themselves, working outside university funding entirely, tracing family names through census records, church rolls, and cemetery ledgers to reconstruct household lists that the official coroner's report never attempted to compile. Their findings, shared through community archives and local historical societies rather than academic journals, have in several documented cases identified victims whose deaths appear in no government record at all, known only because a family kept the memory alive across 4 or 5 generations without any institution asking them to. What the surviving record makes clear, and what a century of riot framing worked to obscure, is that the violence in Wilmington was never a contest between two sides. It was the deliberate, publicly announced, and meticulously organized destruction of a government by men who wrote down their intentions beforehand, distributed those intentions as a formal declaration, and then carried them out on schedule when a letter meant to forestall the violence failed, for reasons still not fully settled, to arrive on time. The city that resulted from that morning, its politics, its demographics, its wealth distribution, carried the mark of November 10th for the rest of the 20th century and into this one. The Daily Record's ashes were cleared from the lot on 7th Street long ago. What was built on the political ground it left behind took considerably longer to even be named correctly, and the naming is, in places, still being finished. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.